Some of the ground that I was going to discuss has been covered, which is great, so I can dig in a little more detail. What I'm going to talk about is briefly about, kind of just as a general matter, why is it inevitable that states will keep a role? Why is it desirable? And then really turn to the preemption question and talk some about, I think, misunderstandings of how preemption works, how it will be used, how it will be abused, and then in particular close by suggesting that what we need to do is to bureaucratize preemptive action review, and I'll explain what I mean by that towards the end. So first, I think if we idealize federal law, the idea that you need the state role would seem, maybe there wouldn't be a need, but I think we have to always start with the assumption of regulatory failure. And Bill Becker did a nice job in summarizing some of the ways in which federal law could fall short, but I think there are a lot more, and so I'm going to rattle off a few, but this is just to say that I think whatever we're talking about, you have to assume federal law in some way won't work. So one, of course, is that a federal cap is set and the cap proves is too high initially, so it's just a lax law. Another is a different problem, as he said, 3 or 5 years down the road, the cap proves to be too high. That is, science, it turns out with the science, it is just not effective. We're not getting the changes in emission levels or scientific effects we think. Another, of course, is just that science changes. Whatever we're talking about, whether it's compounds or the melting of the permafrost, whatever it is, that there's something else going on that just changes the focus, and in some way there's a need to get things to be adjusted at the federal level. Another of people haven't focused on enough, and I was at a Harvard conference last year on trading issues, and that people really didn't focus on much, which is this problem of cheating. Cheating and illusory markets, and this is a major problem. If we have cap and trade, there are dozens of ways in which markets can fall apart. And if anyone is unaware of this, just read the newspaper over the last few months. But this idea that we set up a cap and trade and therefore it won't sort of crumble is a major problem with cheating, and that's both at the private level and enforcement flaws. Also, I think we found again and again in the environmental area that very often easy gains are missed. Whatever the environmental goal has been, it turns out that there are problems that people have missed, and you really want to allow the ability of someone other than the federal government to step in to address what might be a missed opportunity. I'll stop there, except that just another, which I think is perhaps the biggest risk, is this climate change is something where we need innovation. Okay? And the worst kind of regulatory failure here would be if there was a structure where stasis set in, where a law was passed and for some reason it just derailed the sort of incentives for innovation that we've been benefiting from in recent years. Now, my sense here is that when people talk about preempting state roles, that it is inevitable that there will be state roles. And in fact, I think it's inextricable. That is, I don't think one can separate out state roles. And first, just by way of observation, when you look at Federal Clean Water Act, Federal Clean Air Act, both of which have strong savings clause provisions, part of the reason they are there is you can't actually make laws work where states have a role if they can't possibly be more stringent. If you just work out what goes into implementation, monitoring, and enforcement, and you take into account land use functions, there will always be ways in which some state or local government will be doing more in application than the federal government might require. And if you say that kind of more stringent action is preempted or potentially preempted, you create a recipe for litigation and a mess. Major source permits, whether power plants or factories, just assume a major source, they are always individually negotiated, and they always have local and state functions. This idea that major source permits will be unduly burdened with an overlay of state law on top of federal greenhouse gas law is, I think, a myth. These kinds of facilities, if you talk to people who work on these kinds of permits, they are always individually negotiated, and they always go through dozens of hurdles, local, state, and federal. Energy regulation is invariably something regulated by the states and has a very direct effect on greenhouse gases. How can you stop a state from fulfilling this role, which has always been a historical state role? I don't think you can do so. When you think about water preservation, similarly, states, power plants are huge users of water. States are struggling in much of the country, especially the West, to preserve water. How can you take a state's ability to regulate water without thinking about energy? I have actually an entire page, a single line of things states do you can't avoid they're doing. I won't read all of them except to say that if you start thinking about just all of the functions states do that have greenhouse gas repercussions, they are virtually unavoidable. That is, you just cannot get rid of a state role in this area. Now, why is it desirable? Okay? One is, I think Bill Becker mentioned some of these, so I'll just rattle off a few. The states are a critical antidote to these regulatory failure risks. With states able to come in and show what can be done, they prove the fact that the federal government can do more. People talk about defensive preemption. Part of the reason federal laws become stringent in certain areas, part of the reason we see the move now for federal greenhouse gas law, is that when the states act, they prompt, the industry will turn to the feds and say, we don't want to deal with a bunch of states. If the federal government passes a law that in some way falls short and the states are precluded from acting, you will never have that state role of nudging the feds to perhaps act more stringently or address missing areas. In addition, I was really struck last night at dinner and talking to people here, the amount of expertise in states like California and other states is, collectively far greater than the federal expertise. People in Washington do know a lot, but they certainly don't know everything. And if you want to have the information and expertise and resources, and of course just the ability to try things differently, states' role is very desirable. Lastly, two things I would also say. One is the role of states in our federal system has long been a kind of rough variant of what people talk about as adaptive management. That is, the fact that states can upset or destabilize the law a bit has constantly acted to make people understand different ways similar ends can be reached. And it ends up being a way to make sure you don't have a regulatory monopoly. And regulatory monopolies, like business monopolies, tend to be a bad thing. States, by existing, can show different means to the same ends and thus sort of allow for adaptive learning and adjustment. Lastly, one thing I want to point out, a reason states are desirable is one of the ways in which states have historically acted is in major source permitting. And the way it's been done, I want to point to one particular program as a template for what needs to be in any federal law. The Clean Air Act has some standards that are called best available standards or best available technology standards. One of them is done by the federal government under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, certainly my favorite and everyone else's. So looking at the audience, Ms. Schmidt, everyone is just laughing uproariously. So Section 111 has actually been quite dysfunctional. It is done by a federal monopoly. The federal government has failed to update it. They've failed to regulate new areas. But there are two other programs, the non-attainment programs and the PSD, the areas that are cleaner than required, where you have a participatory process where in the state permitting it is not controlled by one regulator, but the feds and the states and citizens can come in and benchmark best performing other similar operators. And for people who have worked in this area as I have, and I've talked to people still doing this, this is often where the big inroads on pollution occur. That is, this kind of open participatory process where what can be done well is the subject of debate. And I was speaking with a litigator and regulatory expert at one of the major federal national environmental groups, and he was talking about the process of litigating over the Deseret case, one of these big greenhouse gas permitting battles. And he described just that process, how the fact that the citizens and other states could all participate and get information and really made sure there was progress towards more stringent protections. Now let me turn to the issue of preemption. First, I think people underestimate the pro-preemptive forces. I think when push comes to shove, there is going to be a very strong push to preempt, and for several reasons. One is the pro-preemption forces are not just regressive forces of industry. There are a number of very prominent, respected academics who have written about pro-preemption arguments and continue to do so. Two professors associated with Duke University have written several pieces. They are former active staffers in Washington. The coal industry last year came out with some pro-preemptive language that talked about preempting any state law that had the force and effect of law related to greenhouse gases.